There is very much speculation as to how battle lines will be drawn. Will they be between states? Will they be rural versus urban? Will civilians be fighting each other in the streets? Who are the combatants? This all depends heavily on what triggers the war, but the most likely outcome, most especially if the right instigates the war in response to a major political loss, say the 2024 election, will be insurgency against the federal government and military. The reason for this conclusion insofar as a right-wing insurgency is that polarization is most intensely felt on the civilian level, especially on the side of the right wing. We're not likely to see the Republican Party in one voice say, "We are going to war," nor are we likely to see large numbers of red states secede and declare the federal government illegitimate, though I would not rule that possibility out, especially if manifested on a smaller scale. That is, a few states breaking away in support of a rebel group, or sympathetic states simply providing aid and assistance to the rebels while remaining in the Union. In all likelihood, the spark for war, if triggered by the right, will come from organized civilian groups. Insurgency is the scenario which the vast majority of militant right-wingers have been both physically and mentally preparing for. This is manifest in the fixation upon gun ownership as a challenge to perceived threats of federal tyranny. It is apparent in historic and contemporary right-wing state-level and civilian-level acts of resistance to federal demands. It makes itself clear in right-wing fascination with prepping, survivalism, even homesteading. And it must be emphasized that this does not scream conqueror. It whines, "Please leave me alone," which further leads me to suspect that a right-wing insurgency within the United States would not seek to overthrow the government or claim the whole of the country for itself, but more likely than not would be a civilian-level secessionist movement of sorts. I'll get into the specifics of where the most likely locations for such a movement to manifest would be toward the end of the video. The preparations made by the right are all signs of a likely defensive war effort, yet despite this, the rhetoric coming from the right would have you believe that they believe they can win an offensive war of conquest, which will either allow them to change the national regime or give them control of all the country or most of the country. Similarly, you'll hear conservatives criticize the left as being weak, inexperienced in survival, and not well armed, as though they were anticipating a scenario in which conservative civilians will be fighting liberal civilians. The left-wing civilian population does not need to fight if right-wing civilians instigate the conflict. They have virtually all national institutions at their back in such a situation. The right seems to think that the left has not been preparing for war just because left-wing civilians don't stock up on guns, ammo, and canned food. But while the right has been preparing for a rebellion, the left has in fact been preparing for war. From screening soldiers for radical beliefs to pressuring for social justice reform in major police departments, promoting officers based on ideological qualifications, discharging soldiers for refusing to comply with COVID regulations, dominating the mainstream media, buying up millions of acres of farmland across the country, the left, or more accurately the social liberals of the United States, have gradually been tightening their grip over some of the most strategically valuable institutions in the country for the last several decades. At best, this is the right setting itself up for disappointment, and at worst means the right has no realistic strategy for victory, whether defensive or offensive. In fact, the only realistic offensive strategy at this point would be a political or ideological strategy, not one of civilian preparation for combat. Because the simple fact is that a domestic American insurgency could not stand a chance against the might of the most powerful military on the planet. The sentiment of the statement I have just made has already provoked hundreds if not thousands of critical comments, including potentially on this very video from those who have not bothered to watch this long, citing Vietnam and Afghanistan as perfect examples of the United States military failing to subdue guerrilla movements, that it's all about asymmetrical warfare or fourth-generational warfare. But these are false examples. Why did we lose to the Taliban and Vietcong? How did a bunch of ragtag guerrillas hiding in the forest and mountains defeat America? Well, they didn't. There's like 3 layers to this, so let me explain. The plain reality is that in Vietnam and Afghanistan, we held military supremacy. We were wiping the floor with both factions as far as military engagements were concerned. The Viet Cong lost anywhere from 500,000 to just over 1,000,000 soldiers. The United States lost less than 60,000. The Taliban lost an estimated 60,000 men. The United States lost 2,500. Alright, so why don't we control Vietnam or Afghanistan? Because we weren't really at war with the Taliban or the Viet Cong. Let us ask, what was the United States to Afghanistan and Vietnam? What governments did we seek to prop up in these countries? Governments that accurately represented the desires of those people? Did the Afghans choose a corrupt, liberal democratic regime run by the country's minority populations? Did Vietnam choose a government led by corrupt, westernized elites? From the perspective of your average Afghan or Vietnamese, the United States was nothing more than an invader propping up puppet governments, and while we deride the Vietcong and Taliban for their anti-American positions, an analysis of their ideologies reveals that both movements were tied to domestic nationalist visions for their countries and people that were shared by much of those countries' populations. What this means is that in Afghanistan and Vietnam, we were not fighting a small group of armed guerrilla soldiers hiding out in the mountains and jungles who just managed to take power after we left. We were at war with the whole of the Afghan and Vietnamese people in a deluded effort to convince them by force to adopt our style of government and values. The Taliban and Viet Cong were not just fringe rebel movements, they were the Afghans and Vietnamese trying to kick out an invader. This is not the same situation in the United States, but some of you will challenge that. Some of you might say, yes, the blue states are basically a foreign country, we are occupied by a foreign government, that is why this is necessary. Any of you who have seen my videos on identity and nationhood within America already understand my position, that the United States is not a singular nation or people, but a variety of peoples with widely different backgrounds and values within a single union, an empire essentially. And in this case, I do agree that often you find one of these nations or regions asserting its authority over another against its wishes. But still, this is not analogous to Vietnam or Afghanistan, two countries who were removed from the United States by an ocean and who never had any chance of being a permanent part of the United States, who Americans genuinely did not care about one way or the other, because they were just so far off in alien places. This here, however, this is our backyard. This is not Vietnam, this is not Afghanistan. But there is an analog to this example, and that's where we get to layer 3. Ukraine and its war with Russia are a very applicable example of two similar yet distinct nations in a military contest of independence and conquest, while directly neighboring one another. Suffice to say, much of Ukraine's endurance during this war is largely owed to massive quantities of foreign support, the absence of which would have allowed the much larger, more populated, and more developed country of Russia to absolutely plow through the country. In all likelihood, if a large segment of the United States were to secede, even at the state level, it could be expected that the Union would be the chief recipient of foreign aid, not the rebelling region or regions. American rivals like China and Russia might provide some support if for no other reason than to further destabilize America, but given the likelihood of the rebelling region to be landlocked, the isolated nature of the United States from China and Russia, not to mention the potential risk this could bring of starting a world war, any foreign support for the rebels would pale in comparison to what Ukraine has received. Even still, Ukraine is not a perfect analogy, as the Ukrainians did not secede from Russia in a military rebellion and have had several years to develop their domestic economy and military. Any rebelling region in the United States would be far worse off. I suppose I should also bring up the matter of the American War for Independence, which succeeded for similar reasons to the Taliban and Viet Cong victories of recent memory, though national identity did factor less in this case, as most Americans had still identified with Britain but simply felt that being removed by an ocean, Britain was not in a position to effectively govern the United States and was too far off to understand local needs. The British, having more pressing matters to attend to locally and not seeing the colonies as all too valuable in the grand scheme of things, simply cut its losses after realizing continuing the colonial war would take more investment than it cared to waste. This would not be the case in the event of an American Civil War, where the federal government will be right there, neighboring the seceded territory and determined to reintegrate it if for nothing else than the purpose of national security. Many on the right will continue to dismiss the threat of the federal military under the belief that the vast majority of the armed forces would defect from the Union to join the rebellion on the basis that most of the military is conservative. Conservative unity is something I will also touch on with more depth further along in the video, but the ideological loyalty of the military is another issue that's multi-layered. First and foremost, while previous generations of military men, that is, older veterans, do lean strongly toward conservative politics, conservatism within the military overall has diminished notably and varies across every branch, with the Marines the second smallest branch being the most conservative. The Army and Air Force are generally regarded to be more conservative-leaning, but at this point they, along with the Navy and Coast Guard, are split right about down the middle. This close divide is reinforced by the strong trend the military seemed to take toward moving away from the Republican Party in 2018 and 2020, with Biden seemingly outperforming Trump across military communities by an average of 8 points. This follows a trend of Republican Party affiliation among the active duty military dropping by over 10 points between 2006 and 2014. Suffice to say, there are several holes in the claim that the military holds near unanimous support for right-wing ideology. And as much should have been made apparent by the post-January 6th military lockdown of Washington, D.C. by some 25,000 troops. If ever there might have been a time in which some conservative resistance within the military would have been observable, when the supposedly ultra-conservative soldiers would have questioned their loyalty to the establishment, that would have been the time, and the results speak for themselves. Let's dismiss all of that. Even if we assume that not just a slight majority, but the vast majority of the armed forces were conservative, we're left asking how realistic is it that these enlisted men, likely with families, careers, and plans for the future, will abandon all of that to not just take a political stance, but to make themselves enemies of the state, actively take up arms against the United States and its people, risk the security of their family, and betray their oath to 1. The Constitution of the United States, 2. The President of the United States, 3. The officers appointed over them, all for a group of guerrilla rebels hiding out in the woods who by this point would have probably already caused a few civilian deaths. What side is our average soldier going to take? In his oath where he pledges to protect America from all threats, foreign and domestic, do you think he's going to suddenly declare the status quo that enlisted him and trained him to be a domestic threat? Or the militant rebels who might share a fragment of his ideology but are killing people, seizing land, and trying to take over the government? Any mass military defection is unlikely to exceed even 20% of the armed forces, and this is being generous. Once the government finds the country to be in a state of war, wide-reaching wartime powers will see to the censoring of any media that paints the rebels in a positive light. And all that any American will hear from the news is that the insurgency are terrorists and murderers, while the military will be bombarded with information and rhetoric about the worst actions the rebels have committed, to sap any trace of sympathy they might have. The right-wing rebels would literally have to not kill anyone and not destroy anything to maintain even the shaky sympathy that might exist at present, a kind of bloodless coup or armed march, but everything about that would still be a massive stretch.